Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. And for those of you who were not here this morning, welcome for the first time. My name is Tim Riley. I'm the Director and Chief Curator here at America's National Churchill Museum. This morning, we were fortunate enough to hear from Missouri's Governor, Mike Kehoe, and had a panel discussion examining what happened here 80 years ago and conjecturing on the importance of what might happen in the next 80 years by investing in education to make sure that our young people know about Churchill's legacy and story. This afternoon, we'll continue to echo Churchill's thoughts in the Sinews of Peace speech that he spoke on our campus 8 decades ago, but we're going to take a pause and an interlude to go back to the 1980s when the Cold War was coming to an end. It's very well known that Westminster College in Fulton was in many ways the place where, through Churchill's speech, the beginning of the Cold War era began with those famous words, "An Iron Curtain has descended across the continent." It was also the place in 1992 when former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev spoke from the same lectern that Churchill used in 1946 in front of the Berlin Wall sculpture to essentially say the Cold War is over. It's an extraordinary place. And we have with us this afternoon an extraordinary individual who is extremely well equipped to comment on that story. We have with us Ken Adelman. Ken served as the former Deputy U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. He worked very closely with President Reagan and, by extension, Mikhail Gorbachev. He was present and will share with us some of his observation at the very famous summit meeting between President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in Reykjavik, Iceland. We're very thrilled to have Ken with us. This is his first visit to Fulton, and his wife, Carol, who herself has a very distinguished career in public service. Carol was kind enough to speak to some of our students this morning, and thank you for that, Carol. Without further ado, please, Ambassador Ken Adelman. Ken?
Thank you, Tim. It has been great the last few days to be here, especially yesterday was just a glorious, glorious day. I love to see the pictures this morning of Winston Churchill and Harry Truman, and Churchill getting an honorary degree. And in 1981, when Reagan became president, he was flooded with invitations for an honorary degree. The first one he got was from Eureka College, where he went, about the same, I guess a little bigger than Westminster here. He went there, even though he got invitations from every college and university in America. He went there because he went there. And his first words to get an honorary degree is to thank the president of Eureka College and say, "Thank you very much for this honorary degree. I always thought the first degree I got from Eureka was rather honorary as well." And then he told the story that a week ago he was on the Truman, get this, the Truman balcony of the White House, and he was sipping wine with Nancy. And he said, "Nancy, next week I'm getting a degree from Eureka College." And she said, yeah, Ron, you told me that. He says, "Nancy, you know what? I really didn't study very hard and didn't get good grades at Eureka College." And Nancy says, "Well, you told me that before, Ron, too." They were sitting there on the Truman balcony overlooking the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Memorial. To the left is the Capitol building. To the right is the Lincoln Memorial. And then Reagan says to her, "Nancy, I don't know what would have become of me if I had really studied hard at Eureka College and really applied myself. I could have made something of myself." So it is wonderful to see the honorary degrees. And speaking of Harry Truman, it was a great honor, and this ties up with what this weekend is all about. In 1963, 17 years after Truman and Churchill were here, he came to Grinnell College, where I was a freshman, and I had read that he took his morning constitutional at 7 o'clock every morning. So as a freshman, I tootled out to the front door of the Grinnell house and stood there at 10 to 7. And at 7 o'clock, the president comes out. I said, President Truman, do you mind if I take the morning constitutional with you? He looks at me and he says, if you can keep up, yeah, you can stay with me. This is Truman, who before that time said, if you're over 80 years old and you wake up not hurting all over your body, you know you're dead. He was over 80 years old at that time, so I think he woke up hurt all over. And then he went to a class, and I had to take him for breakfast because no one had planned out where he goes to breakfast, or that's another story, and it would take me too long to tell you that story, but it's a wonderful story. Anyway, that was the Harry Truman. Okay, now on to the focus that we have, and that is Reagan and the end of the Cold War. We had in the gymnasium right down the street, we had Churchill proclaiming what is going to be the start of the Cold War, and I think at Reykjavik was the end of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and that's why my book that is entitled Reagan at Reykjavik is, the subtitle is The Weekend That Ended the Cold War. And it's going to be made into a movie that's going to be released in the next few months, starring Jeff Daniels as Reagan, starring J.K. Simmons as George Shultz, and a guy named John Bowie Morris or something, who is playing the character of Ken Adelman. I was very careful to look him up right away to see how handsome he was. And I was very happy. I don't care what his lines are or what is portrayed in the movie, but he's very good looking. So I said, great, he's our guy. So that's going to come out. All right, now back to our story without any interruptions. All right, Don, don't let me get off track here. All right, here we are. And 1986 was during the Cold War. There were tremendous fear of nuclear weapons. I was brought up on the south side of Chicago. Carol was from the north side of Chicago. I was a Sox fan. She was a Cub fan. Anyway, I remember on Tuesday mornings at 10:30 in the morning, we were marched into the hall. We were told to get on our knees. We put our heads in our lockers because of the fear of nuclear explosion and attack from the Soviet Union. I was about in 5th grade. I remember asking my teacher, Miss Sinnott, how do we know that the Soviets are going to attack at 10:30 on Tuesday morning, Chicago time? She says, no, the principal, Miss Mulroy, had heard that, and that's when we're drilled. And I said, okay, but my head is in the locker, but my fanny is still in the hall. Won't I fry if they're going to attack? She says, no, as long as your head is in the locker, your fanny is going to be fine. And Kenny, don't ask me any other questions, all right? So that that was I think my first indication that I was interested in nuclear weapons, to tell you the truth, in about 4th grade or 6th grade. Okay, so on the way to Detroit to accept the 1980 nomination, Reagan is asked by his political advisor, Stu Spencer, who died about 2 months ago, why are you doing this, Ron? Why do you want to be president? And Reagan says, without hesitation, to end the Cold War. Well, those of us in the administration, and at first I was ambassador to the United Nations under Gene Kirkpatrick, and then Reagan asked me to do the arms control job. And, we had studied this. We had really learned so much. There was going to be no end to the Cold War. I mean, we knew our history, I hate to say it, but better than Ronald Reagan. We knew the whole international scene better than Ronald Reagan. And it was fantastic to think that there was going to be an end to the Cold War. But he said this, and, we all said, okay. And Reagan not only said that's why he wanted to be president, but he also said how it would end. And he said, 1970s, Reagan envisioned how that would happen. We win and they lose. All right? That was his whole idea of the Cold War. Now, when he was in office, Brezhnev was president of our general secretary of the Soviet Union, and Brezhnev lasted a few months during Reagan's time, and then Andropov, head of the KGB, came into office, and after 14 months or so, Andropov's kidney gave way, and Chernyenko took over as general secretary. Carol and I were very good friends of the Italian ambassador. We saw him, and he says, I'm going back to Moscow for the state funeral for Chernyenko. And we knew that he had been there for Brezhnev's funeral and for Andropov's funeral. So I said, come on, why are you going back to Moscow for Chernyenko's funeral? And he says, Ken, you don't understand. I bought tickets to the entire series. So, so anyway, Reagan was dying to negotiate with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet leader, Mondale, in the 1984 campaign, accused Reagan of being the first president since Millard Fillmore or some damn thing not to meet with the Soviet leader. And Reagan turned to, when he was ever asked about that, he says, how can I meet with them? They're always dying on me, And so anyway, in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev comes into office. And here's a leader one generation younger, smart, vigorous, and he's just very different from the other Soviet leaders that we had known. The first summit that Reagan had with Gorbachev, is in November of '85. And we had spent those on the staff, we had spent about 8 months preparing for the summit, back and forth. And it was going to be in a neutral country, Switzerland, a neutral city, Geneva, and even a neutral place, not the embassy either way, but it was the Aga Khan's grand villa, all right? So it was going to be an absolute flat, even field. Nobody had the advantage. Okay. We were standing there with Reagan at the villa, on November 15th, and it was cold outside. And Reagan started talking about the Queen and taking the horses with the Queen, and I don't know. It was some thought that just came into his mind. We were kind of out of our minds, nervous. Here was Reagan. This was the first summit that Reagan had ever been in. It was Gorbachev's first summit. It was the first U.S.-Soviet summit in 7.5 years. It was a real big thing, okay? So Reagan's talking about the Queen's horses or something, and all of a sudden, as we are in this little circle, the Secret Service comes up, and he says, Mr. President, Gorbachev's limo, ZIL limo, is coming around the bend. All right? It was a magic moment to end the visuals on that summit, and we had planned all this out, but I'll let the Chief of Staff then of the White House explain what happened next. It was an amazing, amazing few minutes. This you have to understand. Reagan is one generation older than Gorbachev. Gorbachev's 53, 54, Reagan's 76, 77, and Reagan comes out like the spring air, and Gorbachev's all muffled up there, and we were high-fiving it among the American delegation, but not only did we see what was going on, but the other delegation saw what was going on as well. Here's Reagan helping him up the stairs in case he falters. He's right there to help him. And the other side understood what had happened. So they realized that Reagan in those first minutes had just blown the summit out of the water, and that was really the high point. The next year, we did not prepare for 8 months for the next summit. It was about 14 days. Gorbachev proposed to come to either London or Reykjavik, Iceland, and meet with Reagan in a come as you are, hurry up non-summit. It was going to be a working meeting. The White House and the Kremlin announced it was not going to be a big deal. There was not going to be many press there. It was, going to be just a working meeting, all right? And so we didn't prepare all that well, to tell you the truth. It was a great advantage to someone like me because Reagan took about, 12 professionals with him. It was going to be a show and tell. It was going to be a howdy and hello, a grip and grin, and because Gorbachev needed more stature for the Kremlin, to be in the Kremlin, and it was perfectly fine with Ronald Reagan. He really loved to grip and grin, so there was no problem with that. And so Reagan brought very few people. Gorbachev comes with 300 people in his party. Here's Reagan alone. Hi, Mick. I see you're set for our low-key, one-on-one non-summit, all right? And welcome to Reykjavik. They went to Reykjavik, and like I say, it was done in 12, 14 days. The American ambassador there, a very, very nice man, was told 12 days in advance, Mr. Ambassador, there's going to be a summit here, superpower summit. The president is going to stay in your house. And he was so moved and touched and excited, and he just burst out smiling until the Secret Service told him, "But you're not." He said, "What do you mean? There's no room," it was a small place, "for you and the security and the doctor and the communications people, so you'll have to go somewhere." By that time, there was no somewhere to go in Reykjavik. Reykjavik, unlike it is now, which is a real tourist place, then it was in the middle of nowhere. And they had 100 telephone lines up to the satellite, okay? It was announced that there was going to be no press interest and, this was going to be a working session. When the summit opened, there were 3,217 accredited members of the press. And so it was flooded. The Gorbachevs had to stay on a boat because they couldn't get a hotel room either. And the place was kind of chaotic, but they did their best. One of the highlights was that Iceland had just been named Miss World. Miss Iceland had been named Miss World. She was on a goodwill tour in Asia. They called her back for that, and so there she is in her Reagan and Gorbachev t-shirt. I thought that my book should have her on the cover and have 50 Shades of Gray or something like that, or 50 Shades of Ice, but they decided that that was a little off, subject. Anyway, part of the negotiations over those 12 days was this was going to be a serious meeting, this would be no press, this is going to be blah, 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 and therefore the wives are not coming. Okay? So Nancy Reagan is kind of ticked off. She met Raisa Gorbachev in Geneva the year before and really didn't like her very much. We had a friend in government who actually went to one of the wise men of Washington one time, and he said, you know what? I can't understand it. Why do people take such an instantaneous dislike of me? And our friend Bob Strauss turned to him and says, because it saves them time. That's what happened with Nancy Reagan and Raisa. Nancy took an instantaneous dislike of Raisa because it saved her time. And anyway, there was going to be no wives, so it really wasn't a problem. We got there at Reykjavik on a Thursday night. On Friday night, the Gorbachevs get there. The plane opens, and the first sight in Iceland is there. Gorbachev and Raisa, all right? Nancy saw that, and she was mighty mad. She called Ronnie to chew him out, and, he said there was going to be no wives. It was agreed, but anyway, she got there, and she made the most of it. Because there was a press lockout for all the summit, you had 3,217 accredited press with nothing to report for 2 days, except Raisa Gorbachev running around town. She changed her outfits 4 times in the first day. She told the Iceland government that she wanted to have 12 cultural events or cultural sites that she would visit. The Iceland government informed her that they only had 6. So what were they going to do? And the second day, they took her out for an hour car caravan to visit a sheep farm, okay? This is like 14 vehicles following her with security and press from Japan and press from this to see a bunch of sheep there that are eating and doing whatever sheep do. Then they turned around and went back to the capital. So that was a cultural event. Anyway, there she was. The government of Iceland was very nice and very accommodating, but not very sophisticated in how to really react to this barrage that was coming to this little place. And on the day before the summit, they called up the NBC with Tom Brokaw, called up the Prime Minister's office and said, we'd like an interview, because people don't know much about Iceland, and can we have an interview? What time, Mr. Prime Minister, can we have the interview? The Prime Minister said, anytime Tom Brokaw can do it is fine with me. He was not that busy. And so Brokaw said, how about 10 o'clock in the morning? I'll come to where you are. And they said that would be fine. They did not know at the time that was the exact time when the Prime Minister goes for his daily bath in the hot springs. So I think this is the first international interview of anybody in a Speedo. at the time. you can see a very young Tom Brokaw there, the Prime Minister in his Speedo right there. And I just, even after all these years, I can't understand his press officer to the far right, why he didn't say, 1 minute, let's get a towel here. Let's make this a little more dignified, your Prime Minister. But anyway, there he was and gave the interview. All right, where was the actual summit? It was in a little house on the outskirts of this island that's on the outskirts of the world, okay? And it's called the Hofty House. It's far away from downtown at that time, from downtown Reykjavik. And it's a beautiful house, but it's very small. Compared to the car, you can see the size. And I'm going to show you real quickly what was happening there. On that side was the American parlor. That's where we sat while Gorbachev and Reagan were meeting downstairs. This is the Soviet parlor where their team sat. This is the demilitarized zone between the two that separated us. And this is the room where they sat. And it was a very small table. It was four of them, the two foreign ministers, Schultz and Shevardnadze, Secretary of State, and the foreign minister, Gorbachev and Reykjavik, and Gorbachev and Reagan, and then the interpreters. And the interpreters were simultaneous interpretation, okay? So what was absolutely unbelievable, but especially because of the magnitude of the event and the size of the place, how small it was, what was amazing was in the basement. The basement was divided. On that side was the KGB with all the latest equipment in the world to send messages. On this side was the Soviet. And they were all crammed in. The basement has a very low ceiling, and they had one bathroom in there that was on the downstairs, and there was a lot of quibbling over who should get the rights to the bathroom, and they went back and forth, and finally they said, let's just see who needs it at that time. And so what I was thinking at the time was the intelligence agencies around the world operate on a need-to-know basis. But the two foremost intelligence agencies of anywhere in the world that weekend operated on a need-to-go basis. And so they were all crammed in. The most amazing sight, of which I do not have a photo, is outside the very little conference room where Gorbachev and Reagan met, were two Army colonels, one Soviet and one American. They were holding a suitcase called the football with the codes of the nuclear codes to blow up the other country. And they were standing probably 15 feet apart from each other for every time Gorbachev and Reagan were in the meeting. And I don't think they looked at each other the whole weekend. At least I didn't see them looking, but they were standing there with their nuclear codes, with the codes to unleash nuclear weapons, while the two leaders were talking about nuclear weapons. The other thing about the Hofty House that you should know was that it, besides being very small and very tight, was that it was thought to be haunted. And it used to be owned by the British Embassy, but the ambassador got spooked. Pictures were falling off the wall, cups were crashing, and they said it's because of the elves and the, whatever, and the whole place is haunted. So some of the cartoons picked up on that. They say this house is haunted with the Hofty House. You want spooky, check out the place next door, and that was the arms race. That was even spookier than the haunted Hofty House. So on October 11th, 1986, at 10 o'clock in the morning, the two men meet. Gorbachev smart enough not to wear his coat, his scarf, his hat, his gloves, his mittens, his galoshes, whatever else he had in Geneva, and Reagan still looking like $1 million. Then they go to the conference room, and you can see Gorbachev, Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister, Schultz, and George Schultz there, Reagan and George Schultz. What's amazing is that over these 2 days, Saturday and Sunday, Reagan and Gorbachev met for 10.5 hours. That's a long time. Without notes, without talking points, without memos, and it really was remarkable how long they talked and the topics that they went to. One of the high points of the meeting for me was right after the first morning that Gorbachev and Reagan met. We were in that parlor room I showed you right above on the second floor. And we were told, get over real quick. The Secretary of State wants to meet you in the bubble. Okay? Now, a bubble is a room within a room. It's in every embassy around the world. The walls are about this thick. It's kind of off the ground with rubber on the bottom. It is absolutely impenetrable. All right? It's absolutely secure. We had a bubble in Geneva for our negotiations. We could get about 24, 25 around the conference table in the bubble in Geneva. In Reykjavik, because nothing ever happened and nothing classified ever happened, it was the smallest bubble in the world. So we went in, and it was little chairs that are much smaller than this, and there were 4 of them on one side and 4 of them on the other, and while we were sitting there, we could feel the other leg right by our leg, and our knees were almost touching, all right? And then we all got in there, and George Schultz, Secretary of State, started to tell us what had happened that morning, and the big vault lock secured the place. It was like on a bank, the vault, and so it was turned and absolutely secure. Schultz was starting to talk about what had happened, and all of a sudden the vault opens up. A big Secret Service guy peers in there, and he says, "The President of the United States." We all stand up. We are now shoulder to shoulder and belly to belly. There are 8 of us there, and Reagan is about to enter the bubble. Okay, and I think to myself, Ken, if you are going to stay in the bubble, and I think to myself, Ken, you are going to stay in the bubble, you better do something quick. Because here comes the President of the United States. He's coming in. He's not going anywhere. There's the Secretary of State. He's in here. He's not going anywhere. There's the White House Chief of Staff. He's in the bubble. He's going nowhere. Here's the National Security Council advisor. He's not going. So I think to myself, well, you're not exactly chopped liver. You're not at the top of the food chart either. So I got to do something quick. So the quick thing I do is come down on my knees and on the ground. I say, before I do, Mr. President, sit here, give up my chair. Reagan, who's a big guy, kind of looks and kind of, gauges how he's going to aim at this very small chair. And so he aims and he gets sitting down. I go on the ground. The Secret Service takes the big vault and closes it. And for the next 30, 35 minutes, I am gently leaning against the presidential knees while he tells us what happened that morning. It was one of the great sights of my life. It was one captured by the BBC right after the Reykjavik summit. You can see a little bit there. I knocked off the sound, but it still shows you what was going on. That's the bubble. And there, I was actually in the middle of the group, but they put me on the side. And so I'm talking to Reagan right next to him. And that's me with, before I dyed my hair white, so I look distinguished. And I was told that that was the high point of that actor's career, was playing me, so I always felt sorry for him, to tell you the truth. But anyway, we did the bubble. We were talking to Reagan every time there was a break in the situation. Meanwhile, that was all Saturday. Meanwhile, Raisa Gorbachev absolutely loved being in the spotlight. Like I say, she went to 6 sites. She changed her outfit 4 times. One of the cultural sites was to go to a hot tub and, in the middle of Reykjavik, where she stood there and gave a speech about world peace or some damn thing. And so she had the press entirely on her hands, and Nancy Reagan getting madder and madder as every minute went on. That night, Saturday night, we had suggested that the experts come together back at the Hofty House. There was a concert with Joan Baez, who had flown in. I wanted to go to the concert, to tell you the truth, but I had to do my job. And at 8 o'clock, we met at the Hofty House, and there we negotiated with the Soviets. At 3:15 a.m., we took a break. At 6:20 in the morning, we stopped the negotiations. I reported to the president in the bubble at about 8 o'clock in the morning, the next morning, Mr. President, we accomplished more last night than we have in 7 years of negotiations with the Soviets. And it was amazing because Reagan had set it up beautifully during the day, and we could capitalize on it at night. Now it's the Hofty House at night, and the next morning we were in talking to the president, and here was Paul Nitze, who was then 72 years old, and he was just exhausted, and he was the only one besides me on the far right who had been in the all-night session. And here's the Chief of Staff of the White House, Don Regan, the President, George Shultz, and Poindexter, the National Security Advisor, and me. And that was Sunday afternoon. The President came in and came up to our room several times, and this is one of them. One of the most remarkable leadership, you guys teach leadership, Don, around here. One of the most remarkable things happened right after this. We had gone over the paper. We had talked to Reagan about what we wanted, and it was about 3:30 in the afternoon on Sunday, and Reagan had told us at the beginning of that break, he says, this is it. I'm going to go down one more time to talk to Gorbachev, and that's it. We said, okay. And he says, you know what? I told Nancy I'd be home for dinner tonight, and she's expecting me. And I said, well, Mr. President, she's going to know where you are. It's not like you stopped off at a bar on the way home from work, and you're up to no good. It's going to be okay. He said, no, but I told her I'd be home for dinner, so I got to be home for, okay, fine. Anyway, the leadership moment was that Reagan looked at his paper, and then he started to walk towards the door and then down the stairs to go resume negotiations with Gorbachev. We knew it was going to be a big moment. We said, good luck, Mr. President. It was going to be a big moment in his life. It was going to be a big moment in our life. It was going to be a big moment in history. So he leaves, shuts the door. We're all looking at each other like, ooh, wow, this is something else. Last time he's going to meet with Gorbachev. And within about, 20 seconds, the door opens and Reagan is back. Okay? He gets us in the circle and he says, hey, fellas, I just want to make sure that what we're doing is good for America. Okay? And George, are you fine with this? It's good for America? Don? Richard? Ken? Everybody fine that this is good for America? He knew that in negotiations you sometimes get very carried away, that some of us had been up all night. I had never done an all-nighter before, even at college. And, you want to have the accomplishment. You don't want to have a breakup of it's going to be a failure. But he just wanted to stop, think about it, pause and reflect, and just make sure it was good for America. And he kind of did a roll call of everybody. And we all signed off, and he said, well, thank you. Then we said again, another round of good lucks. This is a very big deal. He went down there, he talked to Gorbachev. Gorbachev wanted, he was good with all the arms negotiations that we had negotiated during the night, but he wanted to kill SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative that Reagan loved. And he tied all of our negotiations, our reductions in nuclear weapons, to killing SDI, and Reagan would not do it. So Gorbachev walks Reagan out to the car after it breaks up. Gorbachev says in a way that's very nice, he says, Ron, I don't know what else we could have done. Reagan looks at him in his best John Wayne moment, sticks his finger right in Gorbachev's chest, and he says, well, you could have said yes. And then he turns around and goes into the car. Now, Ronald Reagan was Irish. He was almost never really mad. But when he got mad, got mad. And we all went to the embassy, which was, about 3 minutes away, 2 minutes away. And we walked in, and all of us could see, don't talk to the president. He was going back and forth and back and forth. His Irish face was real red at anger, and he was fit to be tied. And the word came out, the summit fails, Star Wars sinks the summit, a policy disarray, Reagan magic failed, on and on. It was a total failure. I was in an interview with Sam Donaldson that afternoon, and I said, I don't believe it's a failure at all. I think that what we've done is reduce nuclear weapons more than we have for 7 years of constant negotiations. And then Sam Donaldson said, yes, but they're all tied to SCI. I said, I know, but the Soviets are going to untie it before long, so don't worry about it. Anyway, I was optimistic, but others were not. Reagan was furious about it. He went out to the Keflavik airport, and there was all kinds of NATO troops, 1,000 NATO troops, mostly American, and Reagan got his composure back when he stood in front of them and addressed them. Everything was locked. This was October of 1986. By, I think it was December, maybe early January of 87, the Soviets had come back to the negotiations just on the basis of what we had done all-night session in Reykjavik, and all of us were wondering, but none of us had asked, how about tying it to SDI? That was all over, and it was forgotten. Then, in June of 1987, the invitation comes to Ronald Reagan from Helmut Kohl, who's the Chancellor of West Germany, to come and celebrate Berlin's 750th anniversary. Reagan says to Kohl, his buddy, no, I can't. I've been to Berlin already, and I'm busy, and, I got stuff to do. And Kohl says, okay, but then he calls back, and he says, oh, Ron, I really want you to come. And, and Reagan always had a very soft heart, especially for people who were friends, and, and Kohl had been wonderful to him. So very reluctantly, Reagan says, I guess so, but Jesus. All right, so he's aggravated about it, He then ensued one of the biggest battles I've ever seen in my 12 years in government, because the White House speechwriters said the first time that they talked to Reagan, okay, you're going and you're toasting 750th anniversary. It's not everybody goes to a 750th anniversary, so we can, say a lot about that. What else do you want to say? And Reagan says, well, I don't know. I think that Gorbachev should just tear down the wall. And they said, well, yeah, I can see that. And he said, well, that's what I think. And so they did some drafts. Colin Powell was then National Security Advisor. George Shultz was Secretary of State. They were totally against it. This was at a very tender time in our arms negotiations, and it was going to ruin the negotiations, so the White House experts said, and especially if they ever used Gorbachev's name. Okay? June 12th, 1987 comes around. Reagan is in Berlin. The deputy chief of staff of the White House is in the limo with him after back and forth, many times on the draft. And he says, 10 minutes before getting to the Berlin Wall, Mr. President, everybody there at the White House, is opposed to this paragraph. Just give the wonderful speech without this paragraph in it. Reagan's kind of looking out the window and kind of daydreaming. And they say, just drop that paragraph that's so controversial. Reagan says, well, I don't know. I think it's the right thing to do. And then he goes back to daydreaming. Okay? He comes out, and, despite all the advice, he gives it.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
I love it watching this, that the big objection was not only making the point, but the real big objection was using Gorbachev's name. And Reagan, just to make his point, has to repeat it twice. Mr. Gorbachev, Mr. Gorbachev. It's like he's speaking to the White House staff. Did you hear me? This is what I think is the right thing to do. And so he gives a speech. All right. Afterwards, everything is going to tumble. The arms control talks are going to be wrecked. Blah, 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 blah. All the doomsday. None of it happened. Okay? We went back and forth between Washington, Moscow, and sometimes in Geneva to finish up the INF Treaty, as it was known, to eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons, the first time and the only time that has ever been done. By December 5th, 1987, the end of the year, the Gorbachevs come to Washington to sign the INF Treaty, and Nancy and Ron, the Reagans, go to Air Force, to the Air Force Base to welcome them. Unprecedented that they themselves go to welcome them into the United States. The welcome with the men was very warm. They had spent a lot of time in Reykjavik, first in Geneva and then Reykjavik. The welcome among the first ladies was a little less warm. It's right here. It shows their feelings towards each other. And then the next day was the signing of the INF Treaty in the White House. Reagan and Gorbachev loved it. We were privileged to be there. I was in the third row right next to Colin Powell and Paul Nitze and others right there. The KGB and the CIA by that time had been very close together. We're in the second row, and Reagan and Gorbachev were signing the treaty. What did the signed treaty did? Like I say, it eliminated an entire class of weapon systems. But secondly, what it did, and more importantly, it started the United States and the Soviet Union on a steep downward possession of the nuclear arsenal. And this is just one chart of what happened. The number of nuclear weapons that at the end of 2020 were about the number that both sides had in the 1950s. It was an amazing, amazing accomplishment of really sinking the nuclear arsenals. Then in the summer, Reagan's last summer as president, in June of 1988, Reagan goes to Moscow and under a big bust of Lenin talks about free enterprise and freedom. And he goes around like a prophet from the Old Testament talking about freedom and free enterprise. He's there for a 4-day summit. Last night, the Gorbachevs take them to the Bolshoi Ballet and gives a state dinner. And then at 11 o'clock at night, after 4 days of summitry, a press runs into the Reagans in Red Square. And there they are. It's almost midnight. And the press guy goes up and he said, "Mr. President, this is pretty exhausting. Why are you here?" And he says, "Well, we're leaving tomorrow, and I didn't want Nancy to leave without seeing this." And so he takes her to see Red Square at night, which is a glorious sight. A few years later, 1989, on November 8th, 1989, the unbelievable happens. The wall falls, and the Germanies are going to be united. Rostropovich, who is the greatest cellist in the world and also the maestro of the National Symphony Orchestra in Washington, D.C., here, and he's Russian-born. He was doing a concert in Germany. He hears this. He says, "Get me a ticket," takes his cello, gets to Berlin, and he says, "All I need is a chair." So he takes a chair right next to the wall here, and he plays Bach's cello music for a single cello, and it's one of the later in life members of his orchestra said, "What was your best concert? You're so famous." He said, "That day, sitting at the wall, playing my cello." 3 weeks later, Leonard Bernstein comes out, and he leads an orchestra of East Berlin, West Berlin, Russians, Americans, and British on the Ode to Joy. And when he's finished, the church bells all throughout Germany are ringing after that. That was in 1989. Just 2 years later, it happened. The end of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev signs himself and the Soviet Union into history, and it ends on Christmas night, 1991. On the flight to Detroit, Ronald Reagan's asked, "Why are you doing this, Ron? Why do you want to be president?" He says, "To end the Cold War." And before that, he says, "I know how it'll end. We win, they lose." On Christmas Day, 1991, the flag, the Soviet Union, ending the Cold War with the Soviet Union. We win and they lose. That was in 1991. 1994, an amazing thing happens. Reagan is sitting in Los Angeles in his office, takes out a piece of paper, and the great communicator, as he was known, he always denied it. He said, I'm not a great communicator. I just communicate great ideas. That's all. But the great communicator took out a piece of paper from his desk, and he wrote the last communication to the American people. You'll notice this. It has spellings, mistakes. It has cross out. He just wrote it, and then he issued it without anybody else around, without a speechwriter, of course, without really anybody even to type it up. And here's Ronald Reagan, the great communicator, with his last communications to the American people. It's just a beautiful letter, that just came from the heart, and he had the way with words. That was 1994. 1996, the Iceland government asked members of the two delegations to come back to Reykjavik to commemorate the 10th year. And I felt like a pilgrim going back to holy sites. I was just so moved by the room where they met. I was especially moved by the little bubble where I sat on the floor, and the basement where the KGB and the CIA was crammed in. And we met, and then I left the Hofty House and headed to the Holt Hotel where we were staying, and I stopped and got a postcard. It was this postcard, and I didn't know the address or anything. And I wrote a postcard, got a stamp, and I mailed it. A week later, I was at Simi Valley at the Reagan Library for a commemoration of the 10th anniversary. And I see Nancy Reagan ambling down the hallway. So I go up to her and I said, Mrs. Reagan, I was just in Reykjavik. She said, I know, Maureen told me that you were there. I said, Mrs. Reagan, I wrote your husband a postcard. She looked at me like a little aggravated. She said, well, my husband doesn't read anymore. And I said, well, I assume that's right. I didn't even know the address, but I put, President Ronald Reagan, Los Angeles, Reagan Presidential Library, Simi Valley, California. And she says, well, what'd you say? And I said, well, Mr. Reagan, what I said was, dear Mr. President, I'm back on the 10th anniversary of the Reykjavik Summit, thinking back on the wonderful job you did that weekend and how proud I was to be with you and be a little help to you. Sincerely, Ken Adelman. And she burst out crying,